There is. It's so different, Steve, and we've been seeing that on display here at this international summit with the president piecing together, as the New York Times phrases it, a patchwork of allies, snubbing some who would think would be allies, cozying up to others who you would think would not be. And this is what President Trump, has done ever since he took office. He campaigned on blowing up some of that world order that President George H.W. Bush put in place, if you will. It is a moment to think about. As I cover this president, Steve, the relationship that President Trump has had with past presidents, including 41. There have been instances where we have seen the ex-presidents together. I think back to that Hurricane Harvey relief concert, that service where they all gathered, and there was the moment of those 5 ex-presidents together. President Trump was not among them. There have not been instances where we have seen President Trump as part of that so-called President's Club, leaning on, for example, his predecessors for advice or guidance. He has been, from the moment he was inaugurated, rather isolated from that group. And yes, in the past, they have been from different political parties, of course. But look at what Andrea just talked about. Barack Obama having visited George H.W. Bush just this week, just within the last few days. There is still this sense that presidents have held this special place in American history. They have shared one of the most hallowed grounds there is, the Oval Office, the White House. They have lived there. They have worked there. There is a very small group of people who can say that. President Trump has always been, since taking office, on the outskirts of that group, of that club, if you will. And so this will be a moment when President Bush is laid to rest. We expect in the coming days he will have a service at the National Cathedral in Washington after having laid in state at the U.S. Capitol, that we will see President Trump with his predecessors paying their respects to somebody who was an important person to not just the Republican establishment, but, for example, to people of faith, to those in the broader service community. So it is going to be a dynamic that President Trump will be navigating in the next week or so. And it's one that we saw him have to navigate when, of course, Barbara Bush, the love of George Bush's life, died just within the last year, where President Trump did not attend her service, her funeral, not totally out of the ordinary for a sitting president not to attend, but Melania Trump did go to represent the White House. President Trump at the time, the White House said he was not attending out of respect to the family. So there are going to be some moments to watch in the coming days related to how President Trump relates to the Bush family, to the predecessors in office for him, Steve. And so certainly some moments to watch as we move forward with that.
Hallie Jackson in Buenos Aires. Thank you, Hallie, for that. A statement as well from former President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, who, of course, defeated George H.W. Bush in the 1992 presidential campaign. Statement here from Bill Clinton. I can read that to you. Hillary and I mourn the passing of President George H.W. Bush and give thanks for his great long life of service, love, and friendship. I will be forever grateful for the friendship we formed. From the moment I met him as a young governor, invited to his home in Kennebunkport, I was struck by the kindness he showed to Chelsea, by his innate and genuine decency, and by his devotion to Barbara, his children, and their growing brood. Few Americans have been or will ever be able to match President Bush's record of service to the United States and the joy he took every day from it. From his military service in World War II to his work in Congress, the United Nations, China, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Vice Presidency, and the Presidency, where he worked to move to the post-Cold War World War toward greater unity, peace, and freedom. He never stopped serving. I saw it up close, working with him on tsunami relief in Asia and here at home after Hurricane Katrina. His remarkable leadership and great heart were always on full display. I am profoundly grateful for every minute I spent with President Bush and will always hold our friendship as one of my life's greatest gifts. Our hearts and prayers are with George, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, their families, and the entire Bush clan. Again, that statement just coming into us from former President Bill Clinton on the passing of George H.W. Bush. We still have John Meacham with us. John, I'll bring you back in. We mentioned Bill Clinton defeating George H.W. Bush in 1992. One of the reasons, arguably, that Bill Clinton was able to do that was George H.W. Bush and that decision we've talked about to go back on the read my lips, no new taxes promise that he made. He made that in the 88 campaign. He cut a deal to do it in 1990. He called it a mistake on the campaign trail in 1992. A generation later, I think it was in 2014, he ended up being awarded a Profile and Courage Award from the Kennedy Library in Boston. It seemed as a candidate, and a president, he never learned how to talk about that. But I wonder, what is your sense? Did he always think that was the right thing to do?
He did. He actually got a fax from Richard Nixon during the transition in December of 1988, where Nixon offers him, which Nixon did to a lot of his successors, offered a lot of advice. And one was to go ahead and break the pledge and get it over with, get the deficit under control. This is back when we talked about deficit. And Bush wrote back saying that it would be he'd be dead meat if he did it that quickly. But he did signal, actually, in a conversation with Michael Dukakis during the transition as well, kind of a courtesy call. The man he defeated in 1988, he actually signaled that he thought he might have to break the pledge. So he was always prepared to do it. He did it at a breakfast meeting in late June of 1990. In many ways, as something you've written about, that was kind of the Pearl Harbor of the current partisan, particularly on the conservative side, the bolt of the right and of Newt Gingrich. One story that I think says a lot about this is a story told me by Vin Weber, the former Minnesota congressman who had run Newt Gingrich's campaign to get into the House leadership in 1989. And Gingrich was not a Bush figure, to say the least. He was a bomb thrower. Bush was the guy at whom he was throwing bombs, or at least the world was the target of those bombs. But Bush, being Bush, wanted to have Gingrich over to say, I want to work together, congratulate him on winning the leadership race. And as Vin told me the story, Weber told me the story, only George Bush would think to invite the guy who ran the campaign as well as the guy who won within the caucus. So they're having a big. He knew he would pay a steep price, which he did, both with the Republican House caucus bolting on him and bringing Pat Buchanan into the 1992 race. And Pat Buchanan's 1992 race in many ways prefigured the populist campaign of 2016. But he knew he had to do it. Bush knew he had to do it for the good of the country. And one of the last conversations I had with him, asked him, what do you want us to remember about you? And he hated that kind of question. But he said, we put the country first, made our share of mistakes, but we always tried to put the country first. And that's not just sentiment. That's the substance of what he did.
It is worth remembering that it was at the end of the 1990s, about 5 years after George H.W. Bush left office, that this country actually had a balanced budget and actually began running a budget surplus for a few years. It feels like a very distant memory now, but you look at the boom economy of the 1990s and you look at windfall revenues that were produced by the tax hike probably in 1990 and the tax hike in 1993 under Bill Clinton, both extremely unpopular. But you look at, there was a period where this country cleaned up its books at the end of the 1990s that may seem a little bit distant right now. Joe Watkins, who worked in the Bush White House, joins us now. And Joe, I want to pick up on a point John was just making. He mentioned the name Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, the pundit-turned candidate who challenged George H.W. Bush in the 1992 presidential primaries, in part in response to George H.W. Bush going back on that pledge not to raise taxes. But as John said, the platform that Buchanan ran on, in many ways, one that we would today recognize as Trumpism. He ran on a border wall. He ran on a wall or a fence along the southern border with Mexico. He ran on immigration restriction, not just illegal, but legal immigration restriction. He ran on many of the cultural themes and even the economic nationalist themes that Donald Trump would embrace a generation later. George H.W. Bush confronted that in 1992.
Absolutely. John Meacham was absolutely right. President Bush was somebody who always felt that it was important to put country first, and that's what he did. He put country first, and he did it. He did it and sacrificed basically a second term, but just to do the right thing. And I just had enormous respect for the man. I had the utmost personal as well as professional respect and regard and love for George H.W. Bush. Just not only a great man, but also a good man, a man who cared deeply about people and who was every bit as kind and gentle behind the scenes as he was in public. You remember, of course, the speech he gave where he said he'd like to see a kinder, gentler nation when he accepted the nomination back in 1988. And he really did make an effort to do that. Even in the midst of at the end of the conflict with Saddam Hussein, the president had almost tears in his eyes when he spoke to Congress, because the whole idea was not to needlessly sacrifice human life and to lose people, even in that conflict. And I love that about him. He's somebody who himself had experienced war as a very young man, having been sent off to World War II. He talked about how his father cried as he went off to World War II, and he very nearly died, of course. He was shot down and was dramatically rescued. I think the youngest Navy pilot at the time for the U.S., but he never forgot his experience as somebody who fought World War II, and he realized how precious life was, and he wanted to do everything that he could to make sure that there wasn't unnecessary loss of life in that conflict, and that's who he was, personally as well as professionally. That's who George H.W. Bush was. A very, very thoughtful, a very, very kind man, somebody who cared deeply about people. And remember, when he was elected to Congress back in the late 1960s, he supported, from that Houston district, he supported fair housing. And that was a controversial move at the time, but he supported fair housing because he knew it was the right thing to do. His father, of course, had been one of the Republicans that worked with President Johnson in 1964 to pass the Civil Rights Bill, and then in 65 the Voting Rights Bill. And when he worked in the White House, when he was president of the United States and I was working in the White House, of course, we passed the Civil Rights Bill as well. And I worked closely with the president and the rest of the team to get that done. But I enjoyed working for him. I loved his style. He was somebody who didn't believe in bragging about himself. Very humble. You never hear him talk about himself. He just, let others talk about me, but I won't talk about myself. He said his mother told him not to be a braggadocio, and he clearly was never that. And he always took time to consider everybody in the room. From the least important person to the person who might think that they were the most important. He took time to consider everybody in the room, and that's what I will always appreciate about him. I have a whole bunch of personal memories of kind things that he did, that I saw him do, and that he even did for me when I was on the White House staff working for him. The country mourns, and rightly so, and my heart goes out to his family, to his sons and his daughter and his grandkids. I know that they are sad today because he was a good man.
Joe Watkins, thank you for taking a few minutes and joining us. General Barry McCaffrey is still with us. General, I wonder about the relationship between the interactions between George Bush and the military leadership in the Gulf War, obviously, but in general, that relationship, what was that like?
Well, you raised really an excellent point, particularly when you look at current President Trump's dealings with Kim Jong-un one-on-one, no one else in the room except an interpreter, dealing with Putin one-on-one. I was with President Bush on several foreign trips, Helsinki, Vienna, Moscow. It always used to amuse me when I back briefed the Pentagon that as a general statement, and I was just a lieutenant general representing the chairman of the JCS, General Powell, but I was always in the room. So there might be 5 people in the room, Secretary of State on both sides, the head of government, and I'd be the only uniform figure in there. Now, some of it was the fact that the President wanted me to have direct access to report back to General Powell. But a lot of it was he liked having us around. He was very comfortable with us. You know, both my wife and I have handwritten notes framed that we keep in the home from him thanking us for things we'd done to support the country. So just a very unusual relationship in which all of us, almost uniformly in the armed forces, really almost worship the guy. Your previous interviewers, John Meacham in particular, has made the point about his gentility and his thoughtfulness and his maturity. But boy, he was a unique figure in American society. I normally refer to him in lectures as the equivalent of American nobility, because that's really the way I saw him.
John Meacham, we talked a little bit with Tom Brokaw earlier about some of the struggles that George H.W. Bush had as a candidate with that aspect, the stagecraft that comes with being a candidate for office. The flip side, and I think I had read this first in Richard Ben Kramer's great book about the 1988 presidential campaign, What It Takes. He talked about the personal touch that Bush had behind the scenes, at cultivating friendships, at cultivating relationships. And I think there was an anecdote in there about a Christmas card list that had ballooned through the years to 25 or 30,000 names on it, with a staff to maintain it all year. But this was a cultivator of personal relationships who could have 30,000 friends and they could all feel close to him.
There are tonight and will be in the coming days tens of thousands of people, maybe more, who will feel as though they have lost a very close friend. And that's given to very few people in life, much less in politics. His relationships were not inherently transactional. And that's what most political friendships, quote unquote, are. He was what Franklin Roosevelt once referred to as a master of the science of human relationships. He never met a stranger. I was with him once in Houston, and a waiter in a restaurant said, "Mr. President, you were going to bring me a pair of cufflinks." You know, the cufflinks that all presidents give out. And Bush had forgotten, so he put his hands on his own cufflinks and took them off and gave them to the man. And there will be again an infinity of those stories. The country's going to get tired of hearing what an amazing man he was. But it is that kind of grace is in such vanishingly small supply today that I think the more we can be reminded of it and the more we can perhaps heed our own better angels. Because, again, George Bush was not a perfect man, but he did leave us a more perfect union. And he left us a model of how to behave that might not have always done exactly the right thing, but he was a human being. But he was the best kind of human being, even with those limitations. And I think it's a cliche, but cliches are cliches because they're true. We're not going to see his like again.
We talked so much in the last couple of hours about how the legacy of his administration, of his one-term presidency, has evolved over the last generation, and how he used to talk about the idea of history looking back favorably on his tenure. A generation later, as he passes from this world, is that place in history that he sought, is that secure for him?
I think it's ever more so. I think he will be seen as someone who made courageous decisions. He did them for the national interest. He was, you alluded to it, he was not the best wholesale politician. He was not the smoothest political performer. But, you know, in his very private moments, he didn't really ascribe to that. as he would sometimes, you could almost hear him saying, well, you know, I was president, so how bad could I have been at that? He talked about how he climbed the highest mountain in the world. And I think when we look historically at what he did, I remember Henry Kissinger saying that he had the most consequential, Bush had the most consequential foreign policy presidency of any president since Truman. And for Kissinger to say that when Kissinger hadn't been directly involved, you know it has to be true.
And General McCaffrey, it is in many ways foreign policy, the massive transformations that took place around the globe. That obviously is the legacy of the Bush presidency, and it does seem that no matter what we make of the domestic side of things, that foreign policy legacy, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of Soviet communism, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the Gulf War we've talked about in 1991, those really are just, they're towering moments in history, no matter what your opinion was of the politics or leadership of George H.W. Bush.
Fascinating contrast to today's challenges dealing with Trump, but I don't mean to bring him into the argument to compare and contrast. But you know, one of the great gifts of President Bush and the phenomenal people he kept around him, I mean, we've talked about Secretary Baker, was their ability to build coalitions, and it wasn't just on self-interest; it was also on values and on the personal trust and respect that President Bush had around the world. I mean, I was at a state dinner in the Kremlin, and you could see in the room just this total respect for the President of the United States.
General Barry McCaffrey and John Meacham, thank you both so much for joining us over the past several hours. And please stay tuned to MSNBC for continuing coverage of the life and legacy of George Herbert Walker Bush.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Witt here at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York. It is 7 o'clock here in the East, 4 a.m. out west. America's 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, has died. Over this next hour, his defining moments in the Oval Office, chaperoning the fall of the Berlin Wall and Soviet Union, swift victory in the Gulf War, and one big promise that he could not keep. To his post-presidency, a further life of public service through his foundation, plus the heroism of his early years with 41 as the last veteran of World War II to serve as our president. The public servant, the statesman, the family man. This morning, President George H.W. Bush remembered. Prudence, humility, and a lifetime devoted to public service, the country is mourning President George H.W. Bush. He passed away last night at age 94. His values and ideals now being honored across the political spectrum. The 41st president helped end 4 decades of Cold War. His popularity soured after a coalition victory over Iraq in Kuwait. And his single term came to an end in the throes of a weak economy, but he entered the White House with one of the most impressive resumes of any U.S. president. NBC News' Lester Holt has more on the life, career, and legacy of President George H.W. Bush.
I come before you and assume the presidency at a moment rich with promise.
For George Bush, becoming president was the capstone of a lifetime of public service that would also include being the father of a president. In fact, the Bush family has been among the most prominent in American political history. But while George Herbert Walker Bush grew up in wealth and privilege and went to the best schools, he also learned the importance of serving his country. A Navy pilot during World War II, he was shot down over the Pacific and rescued by a passing submarine. The moment incredibly captured on camera. He returned home, married his sweetheart, Barbara Pierce, and started a family, moving to Texas in 1948 to get into the oil business. They suffered the loss of daughter Robin to leukemia, but raised 5 children. In 1964, the year he turned 40, Bush got into politics, running for Senate.
I certainly hope, and I'll bet you do too, that our children can grow up knowing what freedom really is.
He lost, but later won a House seat and ran for Senate again in 1970, this time with help from President Nixon.
And George Bush, in my opinion, is the best man for America.
When he lost again, Nixon appointed him ambassador to the UN.
I consider myself a very lucky guy.
But his next job was chairman of the Republican Party during Watergate.
You try being chairman of the Republican Party during the Watergate days. You talk about a ghastly assignment.
Bush escaped Watergate unscathed, and Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, made him his envoy to China.
Put it this way, I'm darn happy about it.
Just a year later, an even bigger assignment.
Director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
CIA, I loved. 1 year only, but I just loved it. I loved defending the culture at a time when everybody was down on it.
When Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, Bush left the CIA.
What he will do next, he didn't say.
What he did next was run for president.
I do pledge a new candor.
Bush lost the nomination to Ronald Reagan in 1980, and his political career seemed over until this stunning announcement.
That George Bush be nominated.
For 8 years, Bush was Reagan's loyal vice president, surviving questions about his role in the Iran-Contra scandal to become Reagan's heir apparent.
I am here today to announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
Bush emerged from Reagan's shadow.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
And made a promise he would later break.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
George Bush defeated Democrat Mike Dukakis in 1988 and became President of the United States.
So help me God.
The Bush years saw epic events on the world stage: the Tiananmen Square massacre, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself.
By the grace of God, America won the Cold War.
But his presidency's defining moment was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait.
This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
Backed by an international coalition, Bush launched Operation Desert Storm and drove Iraqi forces out.
Aggression is defeated. The war is over.
But Saddam Hussein remained in power until Bush's son toppled him 12 years later.
I thought Saddam Hussein would fall of his own weight when the war ended. And I thought they'd throw him the hell out of there, and they didn't.
Bush's post-war popularity soared, then sank over economic concerns closer to home. In 1992, he lost to Bill Clinton, becoming a one-term president.
I had my chance. I gave service to this country, and now I'm perfectly content to let history be the judge.
George Bush enjoyed an active retirement full of grandchildren, fishing, even skydiving. And he saw his eldest son become president. But he kept his advice to a minimum, and his son charted his own course. Bush was no stranger to partisan politics, but he aspired to a higher ideal, as when he teamed up with Bill Clinton on global relief efforts.
You can be political opponents and still work together for something more important than your own political future.
A former president for decades, he saw granddaughter Jenna Bush Hager become a Today Show correspondent.
And what's aging like?
Aging's all right, better than the alternative.
He saw Republicans turn away from the Bush brand and the party establishment it represented.
But the simple fact is...
Excuse me, 1 second.
No.
Rejecting son Jeb's bid for the presidency.
So tonight, I am suspending my campaign.
And he survived his wife of 73 years, Barbara Bush, and welcomed an outpouring of affection for her. Theirs was the longest marriage in presidential history. Throughout his long life, George Bush was admired as a man of decency, modesty, and uncommon achievement, values that, to the end, reflected what was most important to him, his family.
I just want to get up into heaven. I don't get there by bragging on myself. My mother told me that years ago.
And that was NBC's Lester Holt reporting. The other former U.S. presidents are paying tribute to 41. In a statement, Bush's son and the 43rd president of these United States, George W. Bush, called his father a, quote, man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. While President Clinton, in a joint statement with Hillary Clinton, said very few Americans will ever be able to, quote, match President Bush's record of service to the United States and the joy he took every day from it. And President Obama said America has lost a patriot and his legacy of service may never be matched. And an interesting footnote, President Obama met with Bush 41 at his home in Houston just this past Tuesday. Bush's spokesperson, Jim McGrath, tweeting that night about a private and pleasant visit between the two. Joining me now from Houston, the Texas city President George H.W. Bush died within is Msnbc correspondent Garrett Haake. Garrett, with a very somber good morning to you there in Houston. What can you tell us about a city that is clearly in mourning?
Yeah, good morning, Alex. The former president's death will be felt so acutely here in Houston, the city where he'd lived since leaving the White House back in the spring of 1993. Bush had been a fixture in Houston. He was a big Astros fan, a big Houston Texans fan. He was really re-embraced the town where his political career started back in the 1960s. Ironically, this his congressional seat here is now being held for the first time, or will be held for the first time since he held it by a Democrat starting in this new Congress, part of the seismic shifts in our politics since George H.W. Bush was our president. Now, the city of Houston will get a good chance to say goodbye to the former president, as will the rest of the country. The official funeral plans have not been released down to the particular detail level, but here's what we know. The former president will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol later this week, and there'll be a service for him at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. But then he'll come back to Texas, and there'll be a funeral here in Houston at St. Martin's Church. That's the same church where the former First Lady Barbara Bush was honored earlier this year when she passed away. Then the former president will go to Texas A&M University just down the road here in College Station, Texas. That's where his presidential library is. He'll be laid to rest there beside his beloved wife, Barbara Bush. 73 years married. They will lay side by side after what will be essentially a week-long opportunity for the nation to remember and to thank the 41st president of the United States.
Garrett, he had certainly been in failing health of late, so he, despite his love of the Houston Astros that you talk about there, he had not been out and about that much recently. Do you know the last time Houstonians were able to see him or, bestow their best wishes upon him? I mean, it really had been a while because of his failing health, particularly since the passing of his beloved wife, Barbara, in April.
Yeah, the former president had been very much out of the public eye recently. Some Houstonians remarked on the fact that he had not been to the Astros playoff games this year as another sign of his failing health. But he did go cast his vote in person early for the midterm elections this year. And November 1st, there's a photo of him in his wheelchair with the service dog that he actually got after Barbara Bush had passed away to help him, I think, to help also keep his spirits up, out doing his civic duty. A wholly appropriate last public outing, or at least last public photograph of this president, so known and so proud of doing his duty as just a public concept, out casting his ballot here in early November. But again, very much out of the public eye over the last several months, particularly over the last month of his life.
Yeah, you make that that note of that very poignant photo that we have of that of the president casting his vote, also with his very dear friend Jim Baker by his side, helping him to do so. It was really quite something that would be the last public picture of our 41st president. Garrett Haake, thank you so much from Houston. President Trump honoring the former president while in Argentina for the G20 summit. A very short time ago, he tweeted, "President George H.W. Bush led a long, successful, and beautiful life. Whenever I was with him, I saw his absolute joy for life and true pride in his family. His accomplishments were great from beginning to end. He was a truly wonderful man and will be missed by all." A bit earlier, the president and the first lady issued a statement praising Bush's authenticity, disarming wit, and unwavering commitment to faith, family, and country. Joining me now, Andy Card, who served as Chief of Staff to George W. Bush, but served as Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff for George H.W. Bush. Andy, with a welcome to you. I will have to extend my apologies for your loss. This must be a very, very difficult day for you, given your closeness with the Bush family. How are you feeling today? And I'd love to get your most fond recollections of the 41st president.
President Bush was a remarkable man. He truly was one of the most impressive individuals I met in my entire service in government. I consider him like a dad. He was just phenomenal in how good he was. He's probably the finest example of the personification of public service and what it means to be a good citizen, not only in the United States, but a citizen for the world. And it was his leadership style and his ability to listen and learn and then make tough decisions and inspire people to implement those decisions that compelled me to say, I love this person. And I watched his love for his wife and his family. I watched his love even for his enemies. And I watched him build a relationship that would always lead to something that was better. He took things and made them better. So was he a saint? No. But was he headed in the right direction? Absolutely yes. And he was a great friend, and I will miss him. But most of all, I'm grateful for the spark that he lit that caused so many other people to join public service. And the students at the Bush School at Texas A&M are his living legacy. Those who graduate from the Bush School are being inculcated. That's a word that he used to use, that he said he was inculcated by his mother and father to public service. And he inculcated an awful lot of kids at the Bush School, and that'll continue for generations.
You know, Andy, as you served as assistant to the president, deputy chief of staff, this for the years 1989 to 92. When you think about Bush 41's day-to-day engagement, at what level did he get involved in things? And can you compare that to other presidents, notably his son, with whom you worked as well?
Well, President Bush, as president, learned that the toughest decisions are made by the president, and the president has more information than most other people, including other former presidents. And so he was always respectful of the president that was in office. When I was serving as chief of staff to George W. Bush, President Bush would call, but he would call more as a father rather than a former president. He would always say to me, I know the president's got a tough decision to make, and I know he's got more information that I will have, and I will respect the decision he makes. So he never tried to guide me, to guide the president, except as a conscience, to do the right thing. And he understood the burdens of the presidency. He had empathy for every president who served after him, and he valued the relationship that he had with Ronald Reagan. So he was a wonderful example to witness, and I did find that serving in the White House as chief of staff, I benefited by having a friend called George H.W. Bush, who had the understanding of what George W. Bush was going through when he was in the Oval Office.
Are you perhaps specifically referring to the war in Iraq, because you were there for Operation Desert Storm and the like with Bush 41 and the Gulf War, and then, of course, Bush 43 and the Iraq War. Did you get a sense of how the elder Bush thought about Iraq and comparing the two Middle East experiences?
Absolutely. It even started before that. I remember talking to President George W. Bush just before he was, it was the day before he became the president. So he was at the Blair House getting ready to receive the instructions on how to work with the military to introduce a code that would start a nuclear war. And I remember being in that same position watching George H.W. Bush get those instructions. And I told the president that the toughest decision that you'll have to make will be the one that will be to send young men and women into harm's way, knowing that some of them will make sacrifices that you wouldn't want to invite on anybody. And I watched George H.W. Bush make those unbelievably difficult decisions, and I told George W. Bush about it. And it's not a game, it's not a theory, it's a reality. And I was struck by how when President Bush made the decision to go into Panama, and this was the first President Bush, I was there after he had been briefed, and he was sitting at his desk. I thought he was praying. He looked up and he said out loud that he was making a decision that would cause young men to die. And sure enough, some people did die when we captured Noriega and from Panama. And I then met with a family whose son had been one of those that was killed. And President Bush met with them, and it was just a remarkable experience to see him and say that their son was a hero and that he couldn't have done his job without people like his son. And it was very teary, but it was also very moving. And I made sure that George W. Bush understood the personal impact of making these tough decisions that result in people being put in harm's way, where consequences are what anyone would invite.
Bush 41 certainly chaperoned, Andy, the country, the world to a degree through the unraveling of communism, seeing the end of the Cold War. That was all, of course, begun under his predecessor, Ronald Reagan. But what was he most concerned about as he handled all of that?
He was... First of all, he was very understanding of the challenges that people like Helmut Kohl would have to go through and Gorbachev would have to go through. So when the Berlin Wall came down, President Bush was very quick to say we shouldn't be dancing on the wall. We have tough issues to work on, and we have relationships to build. And he wanted to reach out to Gorbachev and Helmut Kohl and make sure that things would go smoothly. I thought it was a remarkable display of the understanding of diplomacy. And he managed the end of the Cold War in such a way that it never became a hot war. And that was pretty remarkable. And there were great dividends that came because of the wonderful leadership that President Bush not only gave the United States, but gave the entire world during that challenging time of the Berlin Wall coming down, when many of us did want to dance on the wall and celebrate. And he said we have to remember that we can't do anything that would precipitate an insult that would result in escalation to a hot war. And so I was a witness to him being the ultimate diplomat, if you will. And he was a leader with empathy and concern, and he was cautious but decisive when he had to be.
Of course, Bush 41, Andy, he lost in 1992 to Bill Clinton after a 90% approval rating during that first Gulf War. Did you ever think that would happen? And when it did you think it was because he'd had to go back on that great line that he gave during his campaign when he said, read my lips, no new taxes, and he ended up having to raise taxes? Do you think that was the catalyst for the loss?
I do believe that contributed most to President Bush's inability to win re-election. We also had kind of a mini recession going, although the economy was much stronger than the media was reporting. I do feel that the president deserved the Profiles in Courage Award for making the decision that he made to accept tax increases, knowing that they were coming with it would be tremendous fiscal discipline that would be imposed in Congress. So for 10 years, the discipline that President Bush put in place because of his violation of that Read My Lips pledge resulted in the savings of literally trillions of dollars for American taxpayers and brought more discipline to how we spent our money in government. And it was a legacy that benefited Bill Clinton during his entire presidency and even into George W. Bush's early presidency.
Andy Card, again, a profoundly sad day for you, but thank you for speaking with us about George H.W. Bush. Very much appreciate your insights.
What a great man.
Indeed. Thank you, Andy. President Trump and the First Lady also issuing that statement on the death of former President Bush while in Argentina for the G20 summit. And NBC's Peter Alexander joins us from Buenos Aires, where he is covering the president. Peter, with a good morning to you. So what did they say?
Well, we are hearing from President Trump early on this day. Actually, it's notable that the president today is going to be meeting with President Xi of China amidst this sort of escalating trade war. As we remember, President George H.W. Bush, who formerly served as an early envoy to China, President Trump today posting what was a gracious statement on Twitter referring to President George H.W. Bush for leading a long, successful, and beautiful life. And overnight, the White House posted a statement on behalf of the First Lady and President Trump himself, where they said, among other things, through his essential authenticity, disarming wit, and unwavering commitment to faith, family, and country, President Bush inspired generations of his fellow Americans to public service to be, in his words, 1,000 points of light, illuminating the greatness, hope, and opportunity of America to the world. That was particularly striking, those words, because President Trump has not always been so kind to President George H.W. Bush's hope for a kinder, gentler nation. You'll remember the president just 5 months ago was very critical of George H.W. Bush, specifically during a political rally attacking his Points of Light, his nonprofit, the mantra, which was Points of Light, that helped raise money for volunteerism. President Trump saying of Points of Light, what the hell is that? Effectively challenging its name, saying, I don't know what that means. George H.W. Bush, they didn't have a personal relationship, these two men. In a book that was written about George H.W. Bush about a year ago, it quoted him as describing President Trump as a blowhard, saying, I don't know him, but I know he's a blowhard, and I don't like him. What is striking about this is just sort of the difference we have witnessed in our politics these days. President George H.W. Bush, of course, becoming president just 30 years ago, but it feels like a millennia ago as you consider the change in the relationships between the parties and the way that we communicate from the bully pulpit, from the Oval Office. There was a tradition that presidents, those living, including the current president, would all gather together, but that tradition has ended in the Trump era. The last gathering of living presidents did not include President Trump. Just last year in College Station, Texas, of course, the home state of George H.W. Bush, as the living past presidents raised money for Hurricane Harvey relief. Melania Trump went in place of her husband to help celebrate the life of Barbara Bush when she passed in April of this year. Of course, today the White House has lowered the flag there, the American flag above the White House, to half-staff. So it will be a closing day at the G20 where much of the focus, obviously, back in America will be focused on the legacy of one of President Trump's predecessors. Alex?
Well, Peter, I will say I'm very glad that fortunately many of us do understand what the Points of Light rhetoric meant for George H.W. Bush. That would include you, my friend. Thank you very much for joining us from Buenos Aires on this somber Saturday. Joining me now, MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell, the host of Andrea Mitchell Reports. Andrea, with a good morning to you.
Good morning, Alex.
Before I get to your personal recollections, because I know that you knew our 41st president and the rest of his family quite well, I'm curious, as we hear the tributes pouring in for this president, what stands out most to you?
Humility, service, and dedication. The fact that he was probably the best prepared president we've had that I can recall. His naval service from a young age of 18, the youngest naval aviator in World War II in the American forces, all through being CIA director, being the envoy to China before we had actually, had formal relations with China. He was that first envoy, CIA director, a member of Congress. All of those different posts, the head of the Republican Party during a very difficult time, of course, when the Nixon White House was under fire. So he had service at the UN and in diplomacy and in intelligence community. I think the CIA was his favorite post, and the CIA building named after him, certainly a high honor. But just his humility and his dedication to service, and the fact that he was willing to take those hard decisions that Andy Carr just spoke of earlier, the raising tax decision foremost, as well as some of the other hard decisions that he took against his political self-interest and his political base, and not going to Baghdad. At the time, controversial decision with many, but it proved to be the wisest decision of all.
You know, Andrea, we read a portion of President Barack Obama's statement just a short while ago, and we noted that he met with our 41st president just Tuesday this week in Houston. That would make him certainly one of his last visitors. What more can you tell us about that visit and its significance?
Well, it was certainly an important and very touching tribute to the ailing former president by another former president, one of the youngest. But also, it was forged by the presence of Obama in Houston, participating in a 25th anniversary event at Rice University at the Baker Institute for James Baker. And that says something very important about one of his closest allies and longest friend and former Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary in the Reagan years, and longtime campaign manager. So the fact that James Baker was part of that visit as well in Houston says a great deal. The loyalty of those who worked and were friends. You know, James Baker and George Bush were young men, tennis partners in Houston together. It was together that they forged into politics. Elective politics was never successful for Jim Baker, so he was always the side man or the advisor or the wise counselor at the State Department for George Herbert Walker Bush. But to have that kind of friendship, and also the friendship that I think of with Brent Scowcroft, and I'm thinking so much of Brent Scowcroft, the former Air Force general who served so ably and was the National Security Advisor and closest friend, co-author, who had his own residence then in Kennebunkport in retirement, to be close to his friend during the summer months. So that is another close relationship. Brent Scowcroft, who has himself been ailing and is now one of those that I think of who's so much mourning the loss of his good friend.
And I just want to know from you, a memory that you have of President Bush, Andrea, that you're always going to carry with you. What might that be?
Well, there's so many. There's the aerobic golf matches where we would have to race to catch up with him because he record time. He was so impatient and such a great athlete, and that's another reason for sadness. And that he surmounted it, jumping out of the plane at age 90, only 4 years ago. But think of how he was already suffering some of the effects of that Parkinson's syndrome. But if I could just be personal for a moment, I was at a dinner that he was hosting for the Queen of England, and this was 1991, and it was a very big deal for me. I was not used to, believe me, going to anything like this, and I was going with my future husband. And I was introduced on the receiving line by the President of the United States to Her Majesty the Queen of England as Barbara. And I know that his wife later told him of the error, and it did not matter to me. I was just thrilled to be there, but he thought that I might have been embarrassed by that. And the very next morning, before I left for my job on Capitol Hill at the time, I was the chief congressional correspondent, there was a delivery from the White House with a note from the President of the United States, a handwritten note, and a small gift, one of those, silver trinkets that they hand out as souvenirs. And it was his apologies, and he said it must have been the wine, it must have been how beautiful you looked, whatever. And he then, wrote, and it was so George Bush of Greenwich, Connecticut, not George Bush of Texas. He wrote, je m'excuse, will you forgive me? And then con affecto, George Bush. And I always treasured that. It was just a personal moment, but it was the grace and the manners that he had learned from his mother. And it was also those lessons that he learned from his mother that it stood him in such good stead throughout his life in politics, because he never had the ego and the grandiosity that we see so often in political figures. He was always more dedicated to the service and to making others feel good about themselves. And that was a wonderful touch, and it helped him in diplomacy. And he could take the tough decisions as he did in the first Gulf War, but he could also do it with so much grace.
Well, Andrea Mitchell, I will suggest that the fact that he called you Barbara by mistake was a great compliment to you, since we know how much he respected and admired his wife, Barbara. So that little mistake, I think, was a compliment to you, Andrea Mitchell, and we very much appreciate your insights. Thank you, Andrea. President George H.W. Bush and his mark on history. I'll talk with the historian John Meacham, who wrote the definitive book on the 41st president, next.
You're watching MSNBC International.